It has been calculated that if no accident prevented the hatching of the eggs and each egg reached maturity, it would take only 3 years to fill the sea so that you could walk across the Atlantic dryshod on the backs of a cod. Alexandre Dumas. Good evening, everybody. I hope you are doing well. On Monday nights, I am focused on just all things fishing, fish talk type of stuff. There's a lot to talk about, and fishing, as far as actually with fish, it has been around for centuries, probably since the beginning of human civilization. I mean, foraging, hunting, right? Those are usually the things that people read about in history books. But what they don't realize is fishing was probably more utilized, especially if you're living next to freshwater source for fish. I mean, you've already got your water supply set. You've got different types of fish migrating through the watersheds that you're living in. Next to the banks of those watersheds are a lot of foraged food. I mean, you're going to get a lot of nutrients from the land where the water's coming from. I mean, especially if there's rain, all that's going to run down, and that area where the flooded waters come through, that's just more nutrients. And there's just so much. I mean, you don't have to go and what if there's a lot of fresh water and there's food and stuff to eat. Because if you just look around, if you live anywhere that's just remote, go out of the city, go into just as far away from civilization as you can find. But what you're going to see is, if you drive around, you're going to see a lot of areas, especially if you live in the plains. You're just going to see a lot of areas where it's just grass or farmland, and then you're going to see a bunch of trees, and you see all these trees and they're next to creeks, because that's how those trees and shrubs and plants are going to get their nutrients naturally, through a water source. So a lot of that isn't ever covered very much, and I would like to cover it. Before I start, I will want to mention something every time, because it's getting to that point where I think it's useful. So in the description box on YouTube, you may find it on vim.tv and Steam it. You're going to find information in the description box. There's quote of the day and donations added to paypal.me. Of course, you could donate via cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Vertcoin, which I would prefer, but I know people don't. And of course, I've got pretty much $0 worth of donations to this day from that. I have gotten some from super chats, which Google takes a big chunk. So if you would rather do that, I will make a thank you video for any donations received at the first video of the month, along with a thank you. And some of it will be paid will be used to pay for the Zoom meeting. That's more of the pro version. I may have to settle for the free version if I don't raise enough money. So in every session, you can always find the Zoom meeting link. Sometimes I don't, but I will add it in later. Oops, I need to update that stuff later. I'll do that later. So you can always talk with me and to others about the topic at hand. Okay. Hey, how's it going, Port Film Co-op? Um, I guess I want to focus on. Well, I'm gonna focus on the U.S. I should probably mention that. But the thing is, I didn't want to just leave it there. I wanted to be a little bit more expansive. Who knows later on? But in this one, I'm just kind of starting to make a little table of stuff because a lot of times I just kind of speak off the cuff of my head, right? I don't have anything planned to talk about. I mean, right now, this is just just the titles. Um, but I'll probably just kind of paste in some information that I find. What's probably a lot more important is when there are people who can go ahead and oops, there we go. Wait a minute, what's going on? Sorry. Is people who can go ahead and chime in with any information they find, or have just stories of pictures that they have or things that they've encountered in textbooks, whatever. Because a lot of this stuff probably didn't get transferred over very well. But here goes. So just a quick thing here. Just kind of want to explain how plentiful fish were in the past, especially in the United States, as people were migrating across again from east to west instead of west to east or wherever from the Native Americans. And you can find a lot of the history, especially in the 1500s, even in the 1400s, as there was a lot of discoveries made on the coast of the east coast of United States, today's United States. And one of that is we can go over John Cabot and cod, Atlantic cod, and just the collapse of the fish industry that happened in 1992. It's just horrible, but we'll go over that. A lot of people just kind of remember the Lewis and Clark expeditions. I'm messing it up. But I'll get to that. There's more that I really wanted to search because I remember, at least when I was in junior high or high school, reading about Lewis and Clark. And just how there's just so much fish that they're just jumping everywhere that they could just reach out their hand, caught one jumping in the air. That's just how much fish there were in the water. And I'm going to try to find that. And then there's Fort Raleigh back in the 1580s, where there's just explorers and colonists, and the Indians, they really relied heavily on meat of animals and fish for their food. The further north you go, the less you're going to find as far as just foraging that you can have. So a lot more of the food that you can get is just going to have to be based off of game, wildlife. Excuse me. And excuse me. So this one, Indian fishing and hunting, just talks about how Native Americans, they used to catch the fish in these net-like obstruction called weirs. And all they would do is just put them in the water and wait for the fish to get trapped in them. And then they would just take them out of the water, or they would spear them or funnel them into an area and just spear them. That's how easy it was for them to fish. They just used to use spears. That's just how much fish there were. And here's the thing. Back over and this is back in Roanoke Island, they were catching fish. At least the Englishmen reported that the Indians were catching a wide variety of fish, including trout, porpoise, rays, old wives, probably menhaden, mullets, plays, which is flounder, and many other sorts of excellent good fish. 4 months of the year, there are plenty of sturgeons, which is February through May. Also in the same months of herrings, which would be probably the American shad. Some of the ordinary bigness of ours in England, but far more greater, of 18, 20 inches and some 2 feet in length. So that was just there. Now, if you go to lewisandclark.org, talks about different salmon species and the West Slope cutthroat. I'll start with the West Slope cutthroat. It's, I mean, you could look up a lot of this on your own, but I'm just gonna kind of go over it. It's, I mean, it was pretty pervasive, and it's almost not so much anymore. You could read here that genetically pure West Slope cutthroat trout have been extirpated, which is pretty much gone, throughout most of their historic range due to habitat loss and introduction of non-native species. Remaining populations survive in isolated populations, mostly in headwater streams above natural downstream barriers. The introduction of rainbow and brown trout into Missouri River tributaries eliminated the West Slope cutthroat trout from most of its eastern range in Montana. Introductions of non-native kokanee salmon, lake trout, and lake whitefish into Flathead Lake and the Flathead River system caused drastic declines in West Slope cutthroat trout populations. Existing populations are in imminent danger from land use activities and hybridization with introduced rainbow trout, resulting in cutbows and Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Even the strongest populations in Glacier National Park and the Flathead Basin of Montana are in serious decline. Reasons for the critical condition of the subspecies include habitat destruction from logging, road building, grazing, mining, urban development, agriculture, and dams, introduction of non-native hatchery strains, competition, and hybridization of introduced non-native fish species. So a lot of that, I mean, I could pretty much put all of this in my little documentation here. So as far as the Lewis and Clark days, here's what was reported. Perversions in the quartz on board larder had dwindled considerably by the time they reached the forks of the Jefferson. They had built but little of their salt meat left, and only a few remnants of the corn they had departed Fort Mandan with. Near Fortunate Camp on August 19, 3 hunters bagged 2 deer, while several of the men caught some nice large West Slope cutthroat trout. Some of the other men, according to Private Whitehouse, hauled the fish net across the river but caught none any other way but with a hook and line. Hook and line fishing was mediocre the next day also, and the hunting was worse. On the 22nd, however, their luck changed when the Indians, very kind and friendly, helped them make a fish drag out of willows. They tied bunches of them together and made it long enough to reach across the river, and it caught with it 520 different kinds of fine panfish. I mean, can you imagine that? I have a hard time naming 20 different kinds of panfish, let alone 520. Obviously, he meant 520 fish of different kinds, of course. Maybe that makes it more correct, but still, 520 fish, different kinds. That sounds more reasonable, but man, can you imagine 520 different kinds of panfish? All right, so I should have read that more. But still, 520 fish? I mean, that's just amazing. We divided them with the natives, he continued, and gave them a mess of boiled corn, which they were fond of. And then there's Great Falls Catch. Lewis had first seen this fish when Private Silas Goodrich caught half a dozen at the Falls of the Missouri on 13th of June, 1805. He observed that these fish precisely resemble our mountain or speckled trout in form and the position of their fins, but the specks of these are deep black instead of the red or gold color of those common to the United States. These are furnished long, sharp teeth on the palate and tongue and have generally a small dash of red on each side. Behind the front ventral fins, the flesh is of pale yellowish red, or when in good order, of a rose red. Oh yeah, people who eat trout, you guys know. Yeah, and that's why they're called cutthroat trout. You know, it's like cutting someone's neck. You know, on their cheeks, you got that dash of red. Very colorful fish. You can see here a little bit better. A lot of people just recognize this type of trout. In 1836, Scottish surgeon naturalist John Richardson, 1787 to 1865, gave it the official name Salmo clarkii. It has since been renamed Ornithorhynchus hook-nosed clarkii. It is commonly west slope cutthroat trout. There have never been any other Pacific salmon in the Missouri River Basin. All right, none. And this species is found only among its headwaters and smaller tributaries. Some biologists believe it may have migrated across the continental divide at a point east of the lake in Yellowstone National Park, which drains into both sides of the divide. So something that has never gone so far. It's probably never gonna get there again, unfortunately. And there's Barbermerisma. An awful lot of hydraulical manipulation went on as people moved into North America. Dams, drainage, landscape leveling, deforestation, all that and more plays into it. Not to mention agricultural chem runoff, and then you have invasive species, culling and planting, etc. Yes. So much we can cover just on fishing alone. And people don't realize it. I did not realize it until I started fishing again. And I'm just kind of looking into the habitats of fish, when certain runs may happen, and whether I can fish for certain types of fish in waters that might be unlisted, like on Google Maps and stuff like that. And no, not really. I would say it's few and far between that you're going to find a lot of naturally occurring migrating fish in the United States that you can fish for. That could be pretty much regulated to very like one or two river systems and stuff like that these days. Even when I was in Massachusetts, going all over New England, I wanted to fish for a lot of different wild fish, if not native, because you can have non-native wild fish. I mean, for example, they're not bred from like a fish stocking area or hatchery. They're just born wild, but of course that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be native. They could be non-native. Anyways, we'll learn more about that now and the later, and with the propaganda of fishing. So going on to the 4 salmon species, and again, it's on the lewisandclark.org, and then we'll move on to the cod, brook trout, and then we'll go to the cod. I mean, trout is the salmonid species is incredible as far as United States is concerned. Okay, pardon me for the cough. Introduction. Without human beings, salmon have no names, but because we're able to distinguish one from another, their differences have become words, and to some of us, a litany. They're American words, Indian words transformed by folk etymologies, Greek words, Russian words. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark observed and described 4 fish belonging to the salmonid family that were previously unknown to scientists, and that were basic foods for thousands upon thousands of Indians west of the Rockies, but also for grizzly bears on the west slope of the Bitterroot Mountains. The explorers' perceptions were necessarily incomplete, since they saw these fish for only brief periods and only at certain times of the year, yet they were generally accurate as far as they went. These 4 fish are anadromous, for the Greek, for running up, spending their adult lives in the Pacific Ocean, then literally sniffing their way up coastal rivers, fighting rapids and leaping falls as much as 15 feet high until they reach their natal nesting places. Now, also, there's the Atlantic salmon on the East Coast, which is in bad shape. But we're talking about this one because Lewis and Clark went west. All right. There the females dig pits in gravelly places. The males fertilize the eggs with their milt, and the female cover the eggs with gravel. The new salmon, called fry, hatch in from 60 to 200 days, depending on the temperature of the water. After eating the yolk of the egg sac in which they were born, the fry wriggle out of their gravel nest to find more food, and their own great mysterious, miraculous journey begins. As they work their way upriver, the silvery Pacific salmon change color, and the males gradually develop hooked noses. Ornithorhynchus is a Greek word meaning hooked. Onkos, nose, rhynchos. Then both parents die. Steelhead trout and Atlantic salmon, however, may spawn several times before the demise. I mentioned that before, but all right, that's good to know. So, first encounters on August 13th, 1805, at the Shoshone camp on the LBRY River in Idaho. An Indian, himself extremely short on rations, hospitably gave Lewis a small morsel of the flesh of an antelope boiled and a piece of fresh salmon roasted, both which I eat with a very good relish. This was the first salmon I had seen and perfectly convinced me that we were on the waters of the Pacific Ocean. The captains immediately made important contributions to the forthcoming science of ethnobiology with their detailed descriptions and drawings of the Indians' fish traps, wares, and spearing, gigging techniques. After their torturous, hungry crossing of the Bitterroot Mountains, they arrived at the forks of the Clearwater River in late September, evidently at the end of the fall salmon run. One of the young men took his gig and killed 6 fine salmon. 2 of them were roasted, so he speared 6 salmon. 2 of them were roasted, and we ate. By the first day of October, they, as well as the Nez Perce Indian host, were reduced to eating dried salmon, which the men of the court complained as working on them as much as a dose of salt. Tainted with the bacteria to which the men's stomachs were unaccustomed, it produced the same effect as glauber salts, a common emetic. That's interesting. They were astonished at the numbers of salmon they saw upon their arrival at the Columbia River on October 18, 1805. We saw a great many dead salmon floating on the river, wrote Sergeant John Ordway, and saw the living jump very thick. Clark added that the number of dead salmon on shores and floating in the river is incredible to say. Ignorant of the species' life cycle, none of the journalists ventured any theories about what they saw and evidently heard no explanations from the Indians. So that's when they spawn and die. Spring encounters. Homeward bound on April 17th, 1806, they passed through the vicinity of the Dallas, Oregon, and Celilo Falls. The expedition members, not to mention the local Indians, were anxious. The salmon not having made their appearance proves a serious inconvenience to us. While camped near the Nez Perce village while waiting for the snow-choked Bitterroot Mountains to thaw a little, both the Corps and the Indians eagerly looked forward to the arrival of the spring salmon run. On May 18, 1806, Lewis wrote, Early this morning, the natives erected a lodge to the opposite side of the river near a fishing stand a little above, as no doubt to be in readiness for the salmon, the arrival of which they are so ardently wishing as well as ourselves. Lewis assumed the salmon runs was related to the stage of spring runoff. At Camp Chopinish on June 2nd, 1806, he wrote, I begin to lose all hope of any dependence on the salmon, as this river will not fall sufficiently to take them before we shall leave it. And as yet I see no appearance of their running near the shores, as the Indians informed us they would in the course of a few days. He was in a tight spot. I find that all the salmon which they procure themselves they obtain on Lewis's River, and the distance thither is too great for us to think of sending after them, even had we merchandise with which to purchase. Can you imagine them now trying to go do the Lewis and Clark expedition? They're not going to find any of that stuff going on. In desperation, following the advice of the Indians, he sent Sergeant Ordway and Privates Fraser and Weiser on a long trek over to Lewis's River, today's Snake River, to get salmon. Setting out on May 27th, they understood from their Indian informants that the Snake was only half a day's ride to the south, but proved to take 3 days, and they didn't get back to Camp Chopinish until noon on June 2nd. Most of the 17 salmon they brought were nearly spoiled, but the rest were edible. That's the problem with salmonids, is they like to live in cold water, so once they're out of the cold water, they spoil pretty fast. Anyways, those which were sound, wrote Lewis, were extremely delicious. Their flesh is of fine rose color with a small admixture of yellow. And they'll go on to the Chinook common salmon. I mean, that's just the importance of fish and the salmon there, which are migratory. They would not. You block off their migratory runs, and no more salmonids. No more salmon. Kshatriya is the Russian name for this species around Kamchatka, USSR. The word Chinook, probably from the Indians the same name who lived at the mouth of the Columbia River, entered the English language around the middle of the 19th century. Largest of the subfamily Salmonidae, Chinook can grow to nearly 5 feet in length and more than 100 pounds in weight. though most mature specimens are under 50 pounds. Chinook can therefore cope with faster currents and will spawn during spring runoff as well as in the summer and fall. It was the mainstay of Indian economy throughout the coastal river systems and is still the most important salmon in the sport and commercial arena. Lewis described the Chinook or king salmon on March 13, 1806 while at Fort Clatsop. The common salmon, red char, sockeye salmon are the inhabitants of both the sea and rivers. The former is usually largest and weighs from 5 to 15 pounds. Whew, that can feed you for a while. It is this species that extends itself into all the rivers and little creeks on this side of the continent into which natives are so much indebted for their subsistence. The body of this fish is from 2.5 to 3 feet long. Oh man, I would love to catch one. And proportionally broad. It is covered with imbricated overlapping scales of moderate size and is variegated with irregular black spots on its side and gills. The eye is large and the iris is of a silvery color, the pupil black. The rostrum or nose extends beyond the underjaw, and both the upper and lower jaws are armed with a single series of long teeth which are subulate, tapering to a point and inflected, bent inwards near the extremities of the jaws, where they are also more closely arranged. They have some sharp teeth of smaller size and same shape placed on the tongue, which is thick and fleshy. The fins of the back too. I would say go ahead and read the description. You guys can just look at a picture. Anyways, the roes of this fish are much esteemed by the natives, who dry them in the sun and preserve them for a great length of time. They are about the size of a small pea, nearly transparent and of a reddish yellow color. They resemble very much at a little distance the common currents of our gardens, but are more yellow. So basically, they're talking about what is that term? Caviar. They're talking about caviar. Bob saying, I forgot sewage and industrial waste dumping, but those are just more logs on the fire. We have creeks here that were once considered navigable streams, not only by chance either, that are now little more than a trickle except during spring snow melt and rains. Sockeye red char. Nurka is the Russian popular name of the species. The name sockeye possibly comes from Salishan-speaking Indians of southern Vancouver Island. Sockeye live in freshwater lakes for their first 2 or 3 years, then spend their adult lives in the Pacific Ocean from the Bering Sea to southern California to northern Japan. Their sensitivity to habitat deterioration had threatened their survival, and they were the first anadromous species to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. They are still on the verge of extinction. Mature sockeye weigh in at an average of only about 6.5 pounds. They can migrate more than 1,000 miles to reach preferred spawning beds. A subspecies called kokanee is smaller landlocked relative. Oh man. And there's Captain Lewis identified the fish now called sockeye as the red char. But the char belongs to genus Savalinus, the old European term for char. These fish rode on March 13th, 1806. Anyways, you guys can go read that. I just wanted to read about just the plentifulness of the fish. But of course, we know that they had to be plentiful for the reliance on them to survive. They would not have survived on foraging and hunting alone. Fishing was their main reliance. And of course, if there's going to be fish, there's going to have fresh water. So you got fresh water, you got fish, you've got vegetation. I mean, you're going to have game as well. I mean, you're hunting, you're going to want to find a water source for the animals you're hunting. Kisuch is the Russian name for this fish around Kamchatka, USSR. The coho salmon, identifiable by the small spots on the back and upper tail fin lobe, stays in fresh water for its first year, then swims downriver to the Pacific Ocean where it matures in about 3 years. Average adults weigh about 10 pounds, though the largest recorded coho, 38.5 inches long, weighed 31 pounds. The common name coho possibly evolved from the word halcumelum from a Salishan dialect of southwest British Columbia. Matured coho salmon have dark blue backs and silver sides. but during the spawning phase, they turn bright red on their sides and blue-green on their heads and backs and develop the hooked nose. I've seen the photo above. I mean, that would be awesome to catch. Oh, man. The white salmon trout, which we have previously seen only at the Great Falls of the Columbia, had now made its appearance in the creeks near this place. One of them was brought us today by an Indian who had just taken it with his gig, which is a spear. Drawing a sketch of it, he also painted a beautifully detailed word picture, which you can go ahead and see. In general, anadromous fish en route back to the reds do not eat, although they will strike hard at artificial lures. Anyway, steelhead, salmon trout, which a lot of people typically fish for, that are stocked in a lot of United States waters. In 1992, the steelhead trout, Salmo gardneri, the species named in memory of Meredith Gardner, a 19th century naturalist, was reclassified in genus Oncorhynchus hooknose amicus, a Siberian word for the species, a Siberian word. There are two races, both native to western North America. The common name of the freshwater OM is rainbow trout, a colorful game fish that has been transplanted worldwide. The sea wren or anadromous rainbow trout is called steelhead, a word that entered the common nomenclature in the early 1880s. Unlike salmon, steelhead can spawn several times, although the hydropower dams on the Columbia River system have interfered with that pattern, and the species has been classified as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. On December 12, 2000, biologists for the Yakima Indian Nation released the first of 110 revived and rehabilitated kelts, as between spawning steelhead are called into the Yakima and Columbia rivers. All are wearing identification tags, clip fins, and inch-long cylindrical radio transmitters in their throats for tracking, DNA testing, and genetic research. Rugged class steelhead can attain a length of up to 45 inches and a weight of more than 40 pounds. And this is described by Lewis on March 13th, 1806, while at Fort Clatsop. And they always say, the Indians tell us that the salmon begin to run early in the next month. It will be unfortunate for us if they do not, for they must form our principal dependence for food in ascending the Columbia above the falls and its southeast branch. I mean, they were very heavily dependent on it. Okay, and we'll go into all the dams and stuff like that. But brook trout, there's roadmap to restoration as well, and this is a good read. Brook trout are fun to fish, good to eat. They have small scales, so you don't even need to descale them or scale them. They're very easy to catch, in my opinion. Good night. Hopefully you guys can't see me blush. Okay, where was I at? All right, let's go to cod. Okay, I mean, there's just so much that we can just look at. So much that you could look at. I would just say go ahead and look at it. Here is the DowsettFamily.org Heritage Fishermen. I think I'm just going to read a little bit here. Fishermen were first to visit Acadian homeland. Modern historians have pretty well shot down the idea that Frenchmen were the first white men to set foot in America and that one of them led the way for Christopher Columbus, but it could have happened. According to the discredited story, a French navigator from Dieppe named Cousin was sailing off the coast of Africa in 1488, 4 years before Columbus's voyage, and was forced westward by winds and tides until reached an unknown shore. On board the ship was a mutinous seaman named Pinzon, who, after the voyage, was thrown out of the French Navy. Pinzon went to Spain, met Columbus, told him of the New World, and sailed with him in 1492. Ah, that's interesting. There's not much evidence to make historians think the story is true, but who knows? There are a handful of proven instances of ships being blown far to the west and onto strange shores. There is, however, good evidence that the first Europeans to establish a permanent settlement in North America were Frenchmen. They were the ancestral Acadians, and they came to the New World as fishermen. Norman, Breton, and Basque fishermen almost assuredly began fishing Newfoundland's Grand Banks as early as 1497, the year John Cabot explored the area. These Grand Banks are shallow places in the North Atlantic where plant and animal plankton thrive and feed huge schools of codfish. Cabot swore that cod were so plentiful that schools of the fish sometimes blocked the way of his ships. He said that there was no need for a hook, line, or bait. All a fisherman had to do was to drop a basket over the side of the ship and pull it up, filled to the brim with fish. Can you even imagine? I mean, and it says here, that was only a mild exaggeration. The Grand Banks were indeed among the best fishing grounds then known, and Frenchmen were among the first to exploit them. Bastards. Reliable records show that John Davies of Honflower fished the Grand Banks as early as 1504. Other records show that Thomas Albert of Dieppe were there 2 years later. In 1507, Norman fishermen returned to Rouen with an extra cargo of 7 sauvages, probable Beothunk Indians. Anyways, just wanted to show, just you can find this and read it. This is probably the start of history of fisheries in Maine. And this is the Penobscot Marine Museum, education. Here's, I would probably just talk, yeah, it's a short one, right? History of fisheries in Maine. Maine's first fishermen were Native Americans who caught salmon and trout. Mounds of shells called middens tell us that they also ate clams. When John Cabot crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1497, he found so many large cod on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland that he could scoop them up in baskets. And then word of this boundary reached Europe in the early 1500s. Basque, Portuguese, Spanish, and French fleets numbering in the hundreds began annual voyages. Indeed, some may have preceded Cabot. By the 1540s, the British had passed laws that encouraged English participation in the Grand Banks fishery. This 1698 map of America by Nicholas Defer shows a cod fishing station. Interesting. Nice. Hard to get a good zoomed up image of it. By the 1600s, Europeans were learning about the significant fish stocks in the Gulf of Maine and along Maine's coast. Well, before the Pilgrims settled the Plymouth colony in 1620, expeditions like those of Bartholomew Grosnold, Martin Pring, George Weymouth, George Popham, and especially John Smith in 1614 reported plentiful fish stocks along the coast of Maine. The coast became a popular summer fishing ground with 26 ships visiting in the 6 years before the Pilgrims arrived. Gosnell named Cape Cod in 1602, and Smith put it on the map in 1614. This was a factor in the Pilgrims' decision about a settlement area. So, fish. The reason they knew they could make a settlement was because the fish were plentiful. So the first permanent settlements in Maine were fishing stations established in the 1620s at Monhegan Island. Other fishing settlements developed on Damariscove Island, Cape Newigan on Southport Island, and Matinicus Island, and at the Richmond Harbor just south of Portland. Although Maine's maritime population grew slowly in the colonial era, the fishers remained an important part of the region's overall economy. Cod fed the slaves in the West Indies and were sent to cities in colonial America. After the American Revolution, British markets to the British West Indies were closed to Americans. The federal government stimulated the fisheries by providing a bounty based on the size of the fisherman's vessel and on the vessel's annual catch. And a lot of politics and governments help to decimate fishing populations just as well. And yeah, a lot of this you can go ahead and read. It's it's pretty horrible, and that's the thing that disappoints me is, like, could you imagine if all of these watersheds and waterways were intact, and people think that the agriculture that we have, which is pretty much a few staple crops, are able to feed everyone and of course we know it's not very healthy, but just fish being plentiful and just a lot more. It's just, I think a lot more people could easily be fed and pretty cheap. I mean, rather than worrying about growing stuff, you just go grab a bucket, put it in the water, grab a couple of fish, and you've got a meal for a couple of days. That's just how much fish there were. And yeah. Anyways, after the War of 1812, fisheries grew dramatically in both Maine and Massachusetts, which in the mid-19th century vied for the position of top fishing state in the country. After repeal of the bounty, Maine's share of the cod and mackerel fisheries dropped dramatically from 5% in 1860 to half that in 1870, and 10% by 1900. And there's a lot we can go ahead and talk about, but it's kind of going over the same thing. Now we're going to talk about cod. Cod was just so plentiful. And we're going to watch a quick video that's about 4 minutes long. But here it talks about a collapse of the Atlantic Northwest cod fishery. It's pretty bad. Maybe this video will cover it, so let's go and watch this video instead. All right.
It sounds like the stuff of legends, but to veteran fishermen off New England's coast, it was the real deal. Codfish so plentiful that it served as the cornerstone of the region's economy. Today, however, New England fishing is nothing like it was even 30 years ago. Older fishermen say those were the days when fat cod seemed to fill the ocean.
All you had to have was a boat, and you could follow anybody you wanted and set around them and catch fish. It was that simple. I would go out here 25 miles and come in with 5,000 pounds of fish every day.
Every fish, you could barely roll them over with your wrist. Barely roll them over to cut them. They were so big, they would, average 35 to 40 pounds, every fish. It was the most fantastic fishery, the most fantastic thing I ever saw.
Old salts do like to tell stories, but these are not exaggerations.
If you didn't see any cod down there, you would throw the line out to one side and just keep bringing it back, and the whole school would come back to you. That's how thick they were.
But by the 1980s, the fleets had grown bigger and much more powerful, with added technologies like side scan sonars, GPS systems, and fish finders. Scientists and fishermen had begun to notice that individual cod were getting smaller and that cod populations were shrinking and disappearing from inshore areas.
We did overfish, and that's where they went. Then the fish couldn't stand up to the technology. It made fishermen out of people. Technology made fishermen out of people who couldn't really find their way in the ocean. But, if you have everything.
By some accounts, the fish were changing their behavior as well in ways that made it easier to catch them.
They stopped spreading out across the bottom. They bunched up. And the scientists say it's a survival technique, but it's the worst possible thing they could have done.
The fleets searched out these hot spots in the water and practiced something called pulse fishing.
Pulse fishing that I've defined it is when a lot of boats hit a population of fish, fish it very hard to a point where it's either depleted or collapsed, and then simply moves on to another.
At the time, no one knew that many of these hotspots were essential breeding grounds for cod, or that when the hotspots were fished out, it would take decades to rebuild them.
So we caught the big ones, caught the little ones, and then we're turning around and blaming everybody. Everybody is turning around and blaming everybody else that they were the problem.
In the 1990s, cod counts hit their lowest point in recorded history. Just 12% of the level thought to be necessary to sustain a healthy population.
It wasn't very long before we had wiped it out. But there's been no fish up inside of the 20 or 30 miles from shore for, like I said, 15, 20 years.
Today there are some signs of recovery, and it could be better still, according to the old salts. If we heed the science and protect the spawning fish, they say this recovery will grow and spread.
I really think that science needs to take over. But we need to start listening to science.
And if that happens, there is a chance that Cape Cod will once again live up to its name.
We can do it. It can be done. I know it can be done. There's a lot of brilliant people. If we can send somebody to the moon, we sure as hell can fix this fishery.
I mean, it's sad. Just greed, overfishing, and all that stuff just decimated entire population of fish. Probably impacted a lot of other fish that probably relied on eating them as well. Probably even some mammals like whales and dolphins and stuff like that. And the one of the pictures that I got from that's used in the preview of this video is right here. The caption for it is like other Newfoundland outports, Cupid's made its living on cod, which was dried outside, as in this scene, photographed at Fairyland in 1938 before being shipped to market. So you just see just littered dried cod. I mean, I'd say there's hundreds, and you got women just picking them up, hauling them after they've dried out in the sun with salt on the ground, and then they were taking them to market. That's just how much fish there were, and it fed towns, cities, whatever, for since the late 1400s. Okay, so you got all the 1500s, all the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, almost 2000s, almost 600 years. They supported that area. 600 years, 6 centuries. And then within the span of maybe 2 to 3 decades, they got totally decimated from overfishing. But that's how plentiful they were for these fish. It's probably like one of the worst things ever, as far as just the decimation of a fishing population that just basically based off of overfishing, exploitation of population of fish. It sucks, and of course they're trying to do a lot of restoration. A lot of people can hear it. Look, even in Maine, you have there's a group in Maine for lobster. Let me just look about. I mean, I looked it up before. Excuse me. There's a Maine Lobster Association over the past 62 years, and which this means they want to make sure that the lobster, which is their main, their main staple, where they get their main livelihood, and of course, MAIN, not MAINE, but it is in Maine. They want to have a sustainable lobster source in the fishing and communities that depend on it. They now are more careful about it because of they know that they can decimate populations like it's happened before and cause fishermen to, all the fishermen, not just the individual fishermen who are just bad luck, get bad luck, but they want to make sure that they let go of the females, especially the females that are breeding, and that they only keep lobsters of certain sizes and things like that. It's very important to them. Same thing, if the whole cod industry, I'm sure that they're waiting for the cod population to grow back, and there's probably still some fishing, but probably a lot of the overfishing, a lot of the corporations and boats and stuff, they left. They have to go for something else. But they would do it over again, and they would probably do something very similar to the Maine's Lobstermen's Association. Some other thing that people don't know is Florida crab claws. I think it's stone crabs. Yeah, okay. So stone crabs, same thing. The Florida stone crab, what they do to make sure they don't decimate the population of stone crabs. I know this is supposed to be a fishing video, but this is very similar. I think hey, we may have to just go with seafood. What they do is they pull the claws off of the crabs. The stone crabs are able to survive, and what they do is they take the claws, put the stone crabs back in the water. The stone crabs eventually molt, and then they have their claws again. So rather than killing the entire crab for their meat, they just take the claws, throw them back in the water, and there you go. And they don't take both claws. They take only a single claw. So that's something interesting for people who've probably never heard that before. And of course, they've got a bunch of mortality rates and things like that. So, and there's harvest dates. One thing that I tell people, probably I would eat stone crab legs. They would probably be the only things I would probably eat commercially. Maybe Maine lobster, I don't know. But at least the stone crabs, I think I might. Who knows? I would rather go and catch them myself. Excuse me. Take a claw and stuff like that. Okay, so I hope this kind of opened your eyes a little bit. I'm sure a lot of you guys already know about all this stuff. And I think more than just teaching our kids to fish, is just telling them about all the stuff that's associated with fishing, how plentiful it used to be, how survival depended on it for centuries, if not, the beginning of human civilization. And how it's always going to be important, how it just fits in with the ecosystem, and how you could probably survive based off of just aligning yourself with fish populations. I mean, if the shit hits the fan community, people will go, yeah, I'll just survive and out in the middle of nowhere, dig a hole for water, hunt. Yeah, that's not going to really work. The easiest part is to find a good source of running fresh water. The cooler the better. From a natural spring, the better. The cold fish will survive there. Warm water fish will survive there. They'll just be a little bit more lethargic. And a lot more fish are plentiful in the northern waters than there are in the warmer waters. But it's the thing that you have to kind of realize. I mean, if you live in the warmer areas, inland, like growing stuff is going to be easier. You might be able to do it more year round. But the colder it is, once you start moving north, you're not going to be able to grow as much stuff. You're going to have to rely on fishing heavily and hunting as well. But fishing is going to be your main bet of survival. And I guess that's it. Eagle playing an anchor. I don't know what that sign means. Season is about to start. Was it hunting season? Is that what it is? Yeah, hunting season for turkey started, although I have not seen turkey here for a long while, which is since the floods. So I don't know if I'll be hunting this season, but who knows? If I spot a turkey, I might. Like, I would have to drive 5 to 6 hours to make sure that I can find wild turkey. Oh, lobster season. Oh, nice. Yeah, one of the things that I didn't really get to do while I was in New England was catch lobster, which I'm kind of pissed about, but of course I don't have a boat or anything like that. So I mean, the best thing I could have done is go out on my kayak, which I really don't want to do in the cold waters of New England, and catch lobster that way. I would love to catch lobster if I had money to buy scuba diving gear. I mean, I'm scuba certified since what, 2000. So it's quite a while. I haven't scuba dived as much because I have to rent the gear in order to scuba dive. Because it's hard, I don't go to like, I live in areas where I would want to scuba dive all that much. So I don't think I would. But then I was like, you know what? I could just scuba dive certain areas. Like, I wanted to scuba dive in Walton Pond, go to deepest part, which is 104 feet or so down, and just see what I could see with a bunch of flashlights and floodlights and things like that. But so much for that. I think we'll have to figure that out another time, or go up to Maine and go lobster. Where do you live? Eagle Plain Anchor? Free dive for lobster? Yeah, I know some people have done that, and I think, like, it's weird. My body is not very buoyant. I had to think smart about being able to swim for a long time, which I can do pretty easily. I've swam for like 3-4 hours. It's just snorkeling, and when I get tired, I just flip over on my back and just relax, and then take a few deep breaths and then go under and just keep snorkeling. And I just do that for 3-4 hours. It's a great workout. I wish I could still do it where there's water clean enough for me to do it. So much for that in Nebraska. Oh, what happened? Looks like my camera died. Oh, there we go. That's weird. I never had my camera die like that on me before. It's not a good sign. All right. Oh, Southern California. Oh man, I would love to go to Southern California. One day. Okay. So that is it, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Mondays we'll focus on fish related topics. Just wanted to showcase how fish was plentiful from a few excerpts, and how the decline of fishing populations have occurred with just commercial overfishing. And there's just so much to talk about with fishing. That's why dedicating it to Mondays is a good thing. Tuesdays, tomorrow night, I'll probably do something with the recipes, maybe with fish, maybe with homemade biscuits is always good. I mean, there's a thing that I was making with my daughter last week. It was pan de campo, which is cowboy bread, and it's basically biscuits, but just in a big pancake-like form. I would rather make probably biscuits. Biscuits last a long time. Aside from the butter and the milk, the ingredients are pretty simple. So it's good staple if you can just kind of bulk up on flour and baking powder and some sugar. And you don't need to use sugar if you live up north. You can probably try getting your own maple syrup in replacement, or if you live in kind of the warmer climates, you can maybe have a bee colony. My wife's gonna have a bee colony this coming spring, so that'll be interesting, and have our own honey, which will be awesome. Anyways, we'll do more topics tomorrow night. I may have a topic tonight if I feel okay with it. Typically it's just about the fallout and catch mechanisms of control systems, which I could probably just go off the top of my head, which I usually do anyways. So yeah, I might do that. You might see me in about half an hour once I prep for it and take a break, maybe a little bit later than that. Yeah, it's a good topic, Eagle, Plane, and Anchor. We all talk about how just the system is kind of being corrupted and corroded and not working. We're gonna have to start from scratch, but that's not always a bad thing. Cooking from scratch, so good, and just doing things from scratch just really makes you feel productive in a way, right? You're more closer to nature. You're messing less and less with things around you. You're impacting less in negative ways. Let's just say that. Something we should pick up again. But all right, thank you for this. This ends the first part of things that you encounter as a fisherman, at least in the United States for now. Who knows where we'll talk next. Good night.